Welcome, 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 everyone, to our latest workshop here from GRIP. I'm Josh Mayfield. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing here, and we're really excited to have one of our partners in version 6 joining us today to talk through a bit of a CISO perspective when it comes to how to engage with these modern work challenges, when it comes to SaaS sprawl, when it comes to identity sprawl, when it comes to all the various data concerns when it comes to a distributed world where access is everywhere and from anywhere and anything in any device, managed, unmanaged, sanctioned, unsanctioned, vendor, partner, third party, it's all of it. It's everywhere, right? And so in that real world that we live in now, it's not theoretical, but the real world realities that sprung up on us, it's good to get a perspective. And so I'm very happy to have Craig Burland and Chris Prewitt from Inversion 6 with us today. And so they're going to give some of their perspectives when it comes to the kinds of engagements they're doing, what they've experienced in their careers in the past, and give them the floor to talk a little bit about how they're helping their clients and organizations, customers of GRIP as well, being able to tackle this particular challenge as it continues to grow and evolve in organizations. So with that, I'm sorry, I kind of didn't advance the slide there. As you know, folks, our workshops are kind of raw and real. It's kind of like you're eavesdropping on a conversation. So apologies for not advancing the slide. With me again, Craig Burland and Chris Prewitt today. Fellas, you want to give a little introduction of who you are and the experience you bring?
Yeah, Craig, you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Craig Burland. I am one of a team of CISOs with Inversion 6. I've been with the organization for about a year, but have been practicing the arts of CISO for about 10 years.
Good. And co-worker of Craig's. I'm Chief Technology Officer of Inversion 6. My background, IT and IT security for about 25 years, mostly in IT security and mostly on the customer side. So I spent like Craig, the majority of my career, engineer, manager, director. One of my last stops, I was a CISO at a Fortune 500 commercial insurer out of New York City, developing security programs and dealing with a lot of these problems day in and day out. So glad to be here. Good to see you, Josh.
Glad to be with you guys. Looking forward to getting your insights as well. One of the interesting things on the agenda, folks, just right out of the gate is, what did we see out there? And when it comes to this wealth of experience that's here on the call today, there's a lot of things to note. There are a lot of things to remark on when it comes to the kinds of threats that we deal with. Additionally, given the war stories, there are some best practices to learn out of that. When we go into events and happenings in our careers and in our life, and when we're trying to secure the environments, there are a lot of learning lessons. And out of that can come opportunities like this to learn from others that have gone down that path before you, and also understand what it takes to prioritize, mitigate, and ultimately control this environment and comply with what we need to, whether it be a framework, a security policy, a regulation, but ensuring that we have compliance around all of these things, along with the security that goes with it. And want to give an opportunity to expose everyone here and everyone that's viewing this on demand, on social, on our YouTube channel or website or whatnot, give you an opportunity to understand Inversion 6 a bit better and how they're engaging with clients and really delivering some solutions that are indicative of everything above in that agenda. So with that, just want to get into the substance of the matter here, but pause for a moment and give you the opportunity to just introduce yourselves. I know you did personally, but who is Inversion 6 and how do you engage clients? Because you have a unique model.
Yeah, I think it's a unique value proposition. So a company's been around for about 38 years, mostly in the value-added reseller space. So, selling other people's kind of products, software, services. And about 15 years ago, the organization pivoted to IT security. I think a good point in time. Myself, I was a customer of the organization for about 20 years through a variety of roles, variety of jobs, a variety of organizations that I worked for. Great outfit, knew the management team well. And about 8 years ago, the company had been kind of tasked with or kind of brought to bear a consultancy. A number of security officers from around town had come to this organization. They were doing that job full time for some large organization, insurance, healthcare, banking, variety of backgrounds, and built a consultancy. With that, that's kind of the people component. We already had a lot of the technology components, whether it's partnerships through Grip, Zscaler, CrowdStrike, whatever else. We've got a litany of partners that we can provide for our customers. And about 3 or 4 years ago, we had stood up an MSSP. So we bring a lot of the people, process, and technology for our customers.
Yeah, that's really good. And Craig, I know you'll get into it here in a little bit, but since joining the organization, you've seen a rapid growth in some of your project areas when it comes to cloud security assessments, SaaS security assessments, and really understanding that new frontier when it comes to the landscape we have to protect, right? And with that, the landscape is pretty broad. And our friends over at Gartner, they kind of have their way of saying things. But the key thing to go in here on, I think, is that ultimate control surface. And they say it as, identity and context. So what is the context of an identity? Well, Cisco did a report, I think it was published in 2021. So it can only be greater now. And it was something like 89%, almost 90% of human interaction with cloud technology is through SaaS. So where's the identity? That's the definition of the context, right? Where it's located, what it's interacting with, and what it is SaaS. And so you can think about this when, of course, we're all from Grip here, and we're talking about a SaaS security assessment and so forth. So let's just be straight. When it comes to the identity and context being the ultimate control surface, we could even mark that out as context is SaaS. So identity and SaaS are the ultimate control surface. That's what it's become because the identities are the targets. The SaaS is the ultimate honeypot to get into source code, to mess with Circle CI, to launch vishing and phishing and smishing attacks against Twilio last year. And when it comes to SaaS, those are the tools that operate the whole show now. And so when you attack the identity, which is the key to get in there, now you have control to the whole enterprise. And we're going to get into some of those things when it comes to, cloud security is SaaS security because SaaS is the thing, that's where the human interacts with the technology. And that's how the context is derived. So it's pretty messy. And so I know one of the first things we wanted to get out here was some of these biggest threats we see. And I know I mentioned a few there, but when it comes to some of the major threats out there, I'll just call out one is duplicate credentials. Across all the research that we do at Grip, approximately between 75 and 85% of organizations that use any kind of SaaS app, and I mean web apps, legacy portals, anywhere that's through a browser type UI, a web app, any of these types of things, we tracked over 75,000. What's interesting is that on average, 75 to 85% right in there are all unfederated. There is no trust relationship with them, but there is an asset that's related to it. And that's your identity because someone has plugged it into that web app and now there is a connection, but it's not federated. That's one of those things that continues to strike me. But again, giving you guys the floor of the kinds of things you're helping clients out there with some of their biggest risks around this big messy haze.
I think kind of looking back, I had the opportunity to speak to some college students yesterday and kind of talk through a little bit of kind of history. I think it's really important that people kind of look back and understand, like, how did we get to where we are, right? And the kind of proliferation of applications internally and all of the directories that were created, right? We certainly had Active Directory in the early 2000s, but that was really before single sign-on was a thing. So you may have come to work, your ERP, you had an account for that. Maybe it was first initial last name. Your Active Directory account may have been first name dot last name. Eventually, kind of migrating to more of an email format with a TLD and an @ symbol in between. It took how many, maybe a decade, maybe a good 10 or 15 years to get down to single sign-on. And then with the proliferation of SaaS, we've kind of gone back to that route where we were focused on value creation first, right? Let me get this application in the cloud. Let's move our HR data to some HRIS system. Let's get some kind of forecasting application. Let's get some reporting capability out in the cloud. Many of these were done in isolation. Many of them were potentially done with kind of in that shadow IT, right? Being developed outside of IT. What's the harm? What's the risk? It's just information, or I'm sure their partner is managing that data appropriately. But you talked about it, and everybody kind of knows it and says it. Identity is the new perimeter, right? That is kind of the new firewall. And it's not just identity, it's that context that we rely on. Usernames, passwords, not enough anymore. Multi-factor authentication, geolocation, everything out, trusted device, right? The context from that zero trust perspective kind of, builds that contextual language that identity systems can take advantage of. But you can still sign up for a SaaS application with a username and password and nothing more, and put sensitive data in it. So it's, from a risk perspective and from a cybersecurity perspective, it's difficult without the visibility of knowing what you have and where it is.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me back in the day when marketing teams and sales teams used to set up pop-up websites to gather customer information from around the world. And they would be, okay, we want to do a product spotlight on this. We want to do a branded campaign around that. And they would collect customer data and they would store it in unencrypted formats. And the hackers would just kind of drive around and they would, grab this and grab that. And it's the same kind of thing with SaaS. It's so easy just to go, hey, username and password, I have company capability. Of course, I used my company account because I'm at work. And of course, I put my company data there because, I'm at work. So it's that invisible exposure that really kind of always used to drive me crazy when I'm in house. And now I help customers see that it should be driving them crazy and they need to get a handle on it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I like the historical perspective there from both of you. But what was interesting as that history's gone along is we've not only empowered them or enabled user choice and so forth, but it was interesting, Craig, you went from, we had all this on-prem HRIS or ERP and so forth, and then little by little we put it in the cloud and we got a cloud-based SaaS app for that and so forth. And now it's become that I went and got that app that I needed to do my job because I am a remote worker from my home out here and need to do my work to get my project done. There's sort of this hyper distribution when it comes to authorization to acquire and get new SaaS and to then do things with it, putting data and so forth. And we kind of planned for it. We kind of asked them to do that. We kind of said, get your own thing, figure it out. And if enough of you are starting to use it, we'll put it in the Okta queue. We kind of told them to do this. Now they did. And we have 109 Microsoft's last report, 109 passwords or duplicates that enterprise users use. That's what of all their apps, like again, you said HRIS and ERP and maybe some CRM, and now it's 80 plus apps per user. And
I worked at a Fortune 500 manufacturer. I left the organization several years ago, and we kind of went through and did a department by department analysis and ended up with over 200 applications. When you start to think about application sprawl, things that you even take for granted, right? Your 401k, who's managing it? Well, it's data and there's money tied to it, right? Is that in your third-party risk management? Potentially, but everybody might just kind of take that for granted. But even the tiny ones, that 2-3 people are using that kind of get by, that maybe are accessing kind of critical data, sensitive data. but those ads moves changes, that identity, right? If that third-party provider gets breached, that username and password is now out in the wild. Does that expose you to anything else? Again, visibility, right? Key to understanding, your entire risk structure. And back to that history, right? 25 years ago, all of our data was inside our castle. We constructed castle walls and dug a deep moat around it, and everything was protected. And then we let that bridge go down, and all of those people are running around the forest now. Our data is in every SaaS application out there, and that firewall, that antivirus cannot protect that information, right? How do we go about it? So I think it has created a lot of security sprawl as well, but it's kind of a tall task to be able to monitor all of those people running around the woods.
Yeah, and there's sort of this independence of movement for them to go and do it, and it's sort of a blessing given to that kind of behavior. Business-led IT, right? Let the business groups, let the individuals figure things out, and again, over the course of time, a gap emerged.
Huge.
And it's not on the gap isn't on purpose. The choice is what's on purpose, and then the gap is the byproduct of just not being able to keep pace with thousands of users in your organization adopting thousands of different apps. Because again, and many of them it's sort of a boomerang. Many of these organizations, the same call to action that they have for their digital transformation of, we want to interact with our customers online and we want to do all of this digitally. It should be easy for customers to download our app. It should be easy for them to start accounts. They should just be able to put in an email and go ahead and have the app. And then their own employees, and this, again, with our tech customers, for example, and anybody that has a portal, right? The same call to action that you have for other people to give you their info is the same thing your own users are doing for all the tools that they're using. So it becomes this recursive thing and an ease of adoption to where now over 200, and that's the figure now, over 203 SaaS accounts in an organization on average per user. During the course of their time there, how many SaaS apps is a user going to access? And it continues to rise, but the security controls for those apps to secure access for those apps can't quite keep pace. And that control gap in the middle there, that becomes the risk zone. And the thing is that you mentioned the kinds of apps that people are using, and some of them may have limited users. I can't tell you how many times you see something like your domain registrar.
Yeah.
5 people have an account to it, but is it critical? But you don't think about it, but that's a SaaS. And some of these things that we don't consider sometimes are all SaaS. The products we're using to run the cloud, run our IaaS, run our infrastructure are SaaS products.
Yeah, we it is kind of a soup out there for a lot of what we have, right? We are using SaaS applications to potentially integrate other SaaS applications, right? We may use some to pull kind of data feeds from, maybe you're an Azure customer for infrastructure as a service, but you're pumping that data into Splunk or some other SaaS application. All of these need to be managed appropriately, and identity being kind of the critical component, but visibility, is key. You can't manage any of this kind of without knowing it. And I love the domain registrar, right? Just because you're housing everything with a particular registrar does not prevent anyone from marketing, from going to another one, using their corporate credit card to pay for it, using their corporate credentials via email to be able to sign up for an account, buy a new TLD, spin up a website in some other geolocation for some need, potentially put customer information in there, potentially have tie customer identities for access into it. I've got some harrowing stories about websites that were breached that had kind of such configuration, and no one knew about it in IT. No one certainly knew about it in IT security, and yet, who's kind of pushed into the front lines of the forest fire of, we need to figure this thing out and figure out what accounts were breached, what passwords were taken, what data may have been accessed. It's certainly a quandary and an uphill battle for security people trying to get their collective arms around this. Not as simple as erecting those castle walls anymore.
Yeah, I think changing how we're thinking about it, I think is really important, because there is no stopping all people from using SaaS. And why would we want to? These tools are fantastic. They let us be more productive. They let the business be more productive. So it's recognizing, hey, the paradigm has changed, but how do I go back to some of my core principles of getting visibility, figuring out my risk, helping my users understand what's going on? I think the majority of them don't get it, that they are sharing their company credentials, that they're putting data out there. Most of them are really just trying to get their work done. This is a great way to go get it done. And as cyber professionals, we have to recognize, hey, there's benefit there, but I need to counteract it with enough controls to let the business do what it needs to do while still making sure that I'm protecting them and helping them do business securely. And these newer tools are helping us do that if we can kind of figure that out and put them in place.
One thing that Josh, that you said, it really kind of hits home, right? From that like 100 to 200, like this continual growth of SaaS, right? Early on, kind of managing by spreadsheet, right? Well, we have 3 partners, we have 5 partners, we have 10. We're not going to put a lot of technology in this because we're managing it appropriately through spreadsheets. The same has kind of happened in cloud, right? Where many organizations are at a tipping point where they've built a lot of on-premise security infrastructure. They've dabbled in the cloud. We have some workload in AWS or Azure, and we've stood up some dev servers, and now we're starting to do some more. Typically, when organizations get to that 30 to 40%, they start to look and say, hey, we've got some weight there. We really may need to invest in like a Wiz or some security software to help us gain visibility into the risks in that cloud infrastructure. We have more and more data there. And I think the same should be viewed in SaaS, trying to manage your third parties via spreadsheets. Ineffective. 1, you're not going to get the visibility. 2, it's a lot to keep up with. Having some application script, present a huge opportunity to kind of automate a lot of the visibility into what you have, allowing and giving that freedom to the business people to operate, build. IT really does 2 things inside businesses. Creates value, right? Efficiency, speed, performance, automation, or it mitigates risk. It's one or the other. It really doesn't do anything else. And, this is technology that, certainly helps enabling the value creation of an organization.
Yeah. That's a really good point that kind of segues into what then would be some best practices. That we've taken a look here, folks, so far at just the malaise of it all, with that graphic you saw and just the different war stories and things that we've seen across the board. It's interesting you mentioned the domain and the marketing team going and spinning up a new dance over. You wouldn't believe the chaos with the Gen AI apps. Oh heavens!
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we would.
Someone literally put their earnings call script into one of these situations, went off and did that, took their credential, took their corporate identity, went and got, I'll not name the app, but it's one of these Gen AI for content writing things. It's not the OpenAI one, it's a different one. And they fed it their earnings call. And then to say, hey, can you write this out to where it's more compelling so that someone would want to buy our stock? They fed their earnings call script.
That's crazy.
To a SaaS app, so that the SaaS app would purposefully read it, ingest it, interpret it, and come back with something different. So that data, to presume it's gone nowhere, no, it's completely transformed into something new. That's how ingested it's become in that app. So yeah, it's kind of crazy. Just in the last year, over 250 new SaaS detections that we've earmarked as Gen AI apps. It's pretty,
Wow.
pretty outstanding. So, it's the latest round, but we were talking before the call about, kind of the three big things, discover it, analyze it, and enforce it and so forth. And just as best practices and how this relates to everything when it comes to our SaaS sphere. Because again, these are like business-led apps and we want them to do it, but some of these things have access to production or are security SaaS themselves. And then some of the things are used once and never again, and it's abandoned, but your identity is still stuck to it. There's a lot of variance when it comes to that sphere of SaaS. But consistently on these best practices, I want to give you the floor here. So much still comes down to visibility, analyze it, and then do something.
Yeah.
I think to me, it always starts with visibility. Every memorable incident in my cyber career has started with a lack of visibility. So I'm passionate now about helping people see you've got to know what's going on. And once you have that kind of information, you can start to make decisions. The SaaS sprawl is really surprising. Like I talk to a lot of people who are like, yeah, I know it's there, but they don't really want to look at it. Or I know it's there, but I don't think it's that bad. Well, okay, let's spend a little time and take a look at it. And if you're right, it's not that bad, great, and you can go back and focus on something else, or you can move somewhere else. But it's the ignorance about what do I have, where is my risk, what are my users doing? Again, that kind of stuff has always been at the root cause of all my bad experiences in cyber. And so I think starting with, hey, let's get visibility and then work from there is that's where it's at. And again, these newer platforms to give you that visibility are just so essential.
That's
Yeah,
really...
go ahead.
Please, Chris, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think Craig spent the majority of his career at one organization where I've moved around a bit more frequently. In this discover, analyze, and kind of enforce, has been part and parcel to all of my experiences. Whether this is kind of on-prem, trying to understand what systems do we have, what data do we have. But the critical nature of it, right? If it's internally, it's plugged into something. All of that can be traced back. There are, a lot of different mechanisms to identify. On the outside, over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, where SaaS has really kind of taken hold, organizations have developed solutions around CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker. We're going to look at your firewall logs. Well, the pandemic potentially nipped that in the bud for a lot of organizations, right? So, I think what's interesting and unique about Grip is how you guys are doing it, and it's really interesting. Everything's kind of transacted over email. The visibility that our customers are getting out of this application, I think, are obnoxious. It's being able to see the level of data, right? A lot of organizations out there may have some semblance, some number. Oh, we have 60, we have 100. They often really don't know. I think we've spent 30 years kind of managing that internal infrastructure, workstations, servers, TVs, access points, what have you. We know how to identify those. We know how to find them. I think we've thrown a lot of darts at the dartboard trying to figure out how to identify SaaS, and all in, I think we've done a fairly poor job. I think there's a lot of risks to a lot of organizations out there. The prioritizing piece of it, still takes some human intervention, right? How critical is this application to business process? What kind of data we have in there? I think that's where kind of the next evolution of likely your product and others are going to be. Like, how sensitive is this to be able to stack rank these third parties?
Yeah, and one of those things, and we were mentioning this earlier in terms of, we didn't say it outright, but the impact. And yeah, the way that we prioritize risk for SaaS apps is really around that account intersection. So when an identity comes into contact with a SaaS and it's worthy enough for you to care about it, it's because a collision, an intersection has happened called an account. And that account is that record of a relationship between a corporate asset of an identity and some third-party service over here, where it's ingested that part of you. And so you now have this connection. And so of that account, think of that account like in the attack surface management context as like a host. So what can be known about it? And then just tearing all of that apart, understanding all of its attributes so that you can determine this triad of risk of accessibility, impact, and usage. And so that tying those things together to then see, okay, if accessed, what can this SaaS actually do? What's its scope of control? What capabilities are inherent in this account, in this SaaS from this identity? And then from that, okay, upon compromise, what then could happen? And being able to assess that and also see the concentration of throughput. Because if you have one user, that necessarily limits your risk, because if that one identity is compromised elsewhere and someone tries to spread it here, it's just, again, one. But if you have 100 users in the same conditions, 100 accounts in those same conditions, now you have 100 endpoints into the data that's behind it. So that's the way that we approach prioritization. How you see it in the product is impact, accessibility, and usage, because all of them tie into the degree of risk in a probabilistic sense of compromise.
I think one of the other really interesting aspects of the platform is showing people that have left the company. So with all of these SaaS apps, only so many actually get IT attention and get, registered properly. So many of them, I don't know the percentage, but I think it's pretty big, is just the user signing up for stuff. And that means they own the account. It is a company credential, but it's not tied to the company. So when they leave, they're taking that identity and all the content that they put out there in SaaS world with them. And that's just this kind of orphaned exposure that when I think about prioritization, it's, wow, okay, visibility showed me this. Those kinds of items make me think we've got to go do something about not only how people stand things up, but how we deprovision from these very loosely federated organizations to protect our data, because it's sitting out there. The whole space is just super interesting, and it's kind of that next frontier that cyber teams have to confront.
Yeah.
Well said.
Very well said. And you brought up the dangling access one. That's a funny one. You're right. A lot of SaaS were adopted back in 2016, and then someone used it twice. And it hasn't been seen again. But again, there's still that connection that persists. And it came and went, and no one ever knew. And the tree fell in the forest and so forth. One of the interesting things to do to prove out that point, I did this with a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago. Nice guy. He and I went to school together. I went to the dark side on the vendor side. He went into the client side. And he was asking me about grip, and he's like, well, but does that really happen? Come on. I mean, that doesn't because they'll shut down your email in Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace. I mean, then you can't use it anymore. Like, you don't understand. They're just characters to the SaaS. They don't know that you're still at the company or not. So I had him just take your old credential to an app that you always used a password for, and just try to log in. He did it right there in front of me. He was like, oh, didn't realize that he himself, a security leader, had an app at an organization where he used just his credential. He, the security leader, left the organization, but could still log in to say, now, is he a target? Do you think that person is a sweet one to nail if they can get back into the app?
Absolutely, right.
For sure. Yeah.
It's right there in that production and security SaaS. I mean, everyone's using this because, again, 80% or so are unfederated, and the necessary way to do that is with basic credentials. Now, I won't bore you with the old quote, but just puts them together of, cloud security is SaaS security in that sense of they go together because it's the operating interface of the cloud infrastructure that's behind it. There is a process that we put out there as a best practice. This is an additional resource for anyone who wishes to download it from the workshop page. So I'm going to skip right through it because it just gives you the timeline of the projection of implementing these things and what you can then see as you kind of hit those milestones along the way, and you will see those risks reduced. But it's kind of an eye chart, so I'm just going to reference that so you can download it from the web page. I do want to give you the floor here, though, Craig. One of these really interesting services that you guys do. We've been connected to it as well. It's been a fun ride so far, primarily making this whole SaaS world safer for everyone. They're not going to go away from it. They're not going to say, hey, well, this was a bad idea. Let's go back to the old way. That's not happening. But how can we make it safe for the new world that we're in? But I want to give you the floor to talk about these cloud assessments you do.
For sure. So what we've been talking about, we've kind of lived and we've seen. I think for our customer base, a lot of the folks haven't had that eye-opening moment. They haven't really seen SaaS compromise. They still have a misunderstanding about the shared responsibility model. So what we tried to do is build an assessment around, hey, let's help you see this kind of risk. We use GRIP as one of our main tools. So we go in and we kind of facilitate a discussion around what is your exposure? How many SaaS apps do you have? Let us talk to you about that breadth of exposure you have, highlight some key things, and then once their eyes are open and probably their ears are open as well, we really talk to them about key strategies of, okay, here's your problem. It is large enough. Let's talk about how you prioritize it and then maybe change your strategy about how to deal with cloud. We end up talking a lot about helping users with better awareness, doing things like enterprise architecture practices where you look at and you're like, hey, I'm going to pick on sales and marketing again. You have 4 sales and marketing apps that do the same thing. Why don't you reconcile those, get some economies of scale, and go there? So we spend probably about a month with our different customers, helping them see the problem, figure out what they need to do about the problem, and either tee them up for bigger initiatives later on, or really just kind of help them get a laundry list of, okay, here are the 10 things that they ought to do. And it's been super effective because, again, even though we've walked through it, it's still a surprise to a lot of people. It's SaaS. Someone else is taking care of that security for me. And they're really not.
They're not. And the precise areas in the shared responsibility model, the precise areas of access, identity, data, governance are exactly what the SaaS providers explicitly say, not my problem.
Right. That's in the part of the contract that you don't read. That's
Exactly.
the click, I want to get to my app stuff. Right.
Yeah.
If I know Craig has read these, Josh. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to peruse a SOC 2 report before, but usually in the back of those, there's a segment of the report called the customer entity controls. And with that, like I forget whether it's O365 or Azure, but there are hundreds of things that are the customer's responsibility that most people would not think are theirs. Backing up the data. Is that your responsibility or is that the provider's responsibility? Often it's the kind of the end customer, right? Whether it's Salesforce, O365, what have you. But we're signing contracts, we're putting things in, we're pushing data in the cloud. We are focused on value creation, and we have no idea where our true responsibility lies. A lot of assumption, and that assumption is, that those end customers, right? The marketing teams, the executives, the finance teams, we want to use this application. We want our data in there. We want this outcome. Well, here are all the things that we need to do to protect that data appropriately. No one's thinking about that side of the equation.
Yeah. That's a very fair point. And I'm curious, Craig, when you're going through these assessments and so on, are there any sort of usual suspects or typical things that you find? I mean, not necessarily like this app name or this app class or anything like that, but the typical things that, it's a larger problem, by this much than they thought, or any other common things that I know sales and marketing, is another any other things like that stand out to you as sort of common factors that maybe anybody watching or viewing this can assume for themselves that it might be the case for them too, if it's that common.
I think awareness is one. I'm a big fan of helping users try to understand it's much more than just don't click on the link. These days, we've got to be better than that. I think the identity problem shows up all the time. of, oh, hey, I didn't know that person still had access, or I didn't know that person had the kind of rights that they had. When we dig deep into apps, it's often on misconfigurations of controls that to the provider make a whole ton of sense, but to the business user who's administering this platform, that toggle switch didn't look scary. It didn't have like 12 warnings around it. It was just oh, share this stuff or make this accessible. So I think that is a theme of these SaaS providers explain things in a way that makes sense to them, but probably don't make sense to the people that are using them and administering them. Yeah, across the number of customers we've helped, I think those themes kind of stand out.
That's helpful. And now take us through here real quick when you go through these assessments, and maybe even really hitting on some of these things in the red that you're really drawing out and pulling out during these assessments, and just take us through kind of what that expectation would be for someone going through it. It sounds like you have a process you follow and some typical things you uncover.
Yeah. So first things that we do is we hook up their environments to the tools that we're using. So Grip being one of them. We do that integration, and that's getting the visibility. Then we take that visibility and we start to look at and deep dive. Okay, what is this showing me? What do I see? Of these 200 SaaS apps that you have, which ones should you prioritize? So we go through that on the customer's behalf because A, they haven't been through it before. And we have the luxury of seeing not only them based on our current experience or previous experience, but we also can look at multiple customers to know what a baseline kind of looks like. So we go through and we analyze that data, we prioritize the findings, and then we really start to engage the customer to say, hey, here's your attack surface. Here's what you're doing in this SaaS space. Here's what you really ought to be worried about. There have been times that I've done this assessment and I've had to call the customer like the next day going, hey, we need to talk because you've got some immediate things that you're going to want to fix before we really deep dive. But then some of them have been more, I'll say, normal paced, where we get the information, we summarize it, we try to wrap it up in a way that's understandable, and then we feed it back to them. So my goal for all these assessments is really to help the customer understand and come away with a good action plan about what they need to do. Whether, again, that's a distinct list of, okay, solve these 10 things and you're probably pretty good. Or, hey, you need to start a big strategic effort around protecting your SaaS. You need to make some investments. You need to change your staffing model or whatever. But I hope for them to be more aware when I leave and be more prepared and then have a plan going forward.
That's helpful. And following on that, so you give them the plan, and sometimes, it's going to vary. Some it's 10 things and you're good. Others, hey, you got a little more work to do here. What does Inversion 6 do to help them execute that?
So part of what we do, especially when it comes to strategic items, is we can come in and we can say, hey, let's build out a cybersecurity strategy, or let's build out a portion of your strategy around cloud security, whether that's SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, or staffing. We help people do that. Chris, gave a great intro of Inversion 6 up front. I think one of the things that stands out to me is we try to be customized to whatever our customer needs. So I don't have a list of 40 things that I do for the same customers all the time. It's not a crank it out kind of approach. So we take this, and if the customer needs help to develop those strategies, or maybe they need to write policies that have impact on these SaaS administrators, we help them with those things as well.
I love that. Yeah. It's
Craig, I've got one quick question for you. Josh had said we found 10 things and they knew about them all. Has that ever happened? I would think on all of the number is shocking to them. How many SaaS applications do they have?
Yeah. Absolutely. And there has not been one of these where we haven't found something super interesting that the customer was like, wow, I didn't know that. We need to go take care of that. I've been on calls where when I've presented the material, the leader has said, hey, Joe, get off the call now and you need to go take care of that. Yeah. And to me, it wasn't that shocking. The shocking stuff I usually call them with. But they've been so surprised and disturbed, they've gone and taken it away. So I think there's enough newness to what we're discovering with these tools that everybody's walking away going, wow, okay, I've got some homework to do.
And I think that kind of talks about or shows kind of where we're at, that, a lot of organizations, they have this risk, kind of sticking their head in the sand, we don't, or we think the third parties are going to be fine and everything's okay and that data is protected. And, we're sure all of these third parties, it's not two people in a garage, that they are quality organizations with SOC 2 reports and everything else.
Yeah,
it still doesn't matter, right? The people that signed up for it have responsibilities, from identity creation, identity management, so on and so forth. I think this is a big kind of stick your head in the sand thing for most organizations. And if they really start to peel this thing back and start to look around and using a tool like this, I think, it is shocking. The results, I think, are really, really interesting.
It is. Just minor plug here, folks. Thanks, guys. It is always surprising, like in a lot of places, and it's not intended for anything other than to bring that awareness. But what we do notice is that people can't unsee it. Once they've seen it, they then say, okay, it wasn't a priority, it wasn't a list, wasn't a project, but it is now. That happens a lot. We'll do a quick assessment for someone. We deploy in 10 minutes, so it's real quick in terms of get that view and so forth. And it's an interesting thing that comes up. Our funny one too is also the controls. They're like, yeah, sure, I have way more apps than I thought, and way more users using way more credentials, but the important stuff I have behind SSO. And then it'll be like 8%. No, you really don't. And it's not your fault. There's a queue as long as my arm when it comes to how we have to get all these apps over. And we can't really decipher, well, who's using it? How much are they using it? Is it really important? What's actually there? Does this really belong in a SSO prioritization or not? That's a whole list of questions. It's going to take you a month to solve.
How is it any different than finding a new data center on your enterprise network, or finding out that your company acquired 3 new companies and all of them have their own infrastructure, right? It's the same thing. You need to go through the due diligence of that discover, analyze, and enforce. It's it's no different, and in all likelihood, it's even more critical because those have firewalls. They're protected from the internet. They've been managed in some capacity. Here, it's an unknown.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not that different than the journey we walked through with OT. Those shop floor things are all fine. They're just running a machine. What could be wrong with them? And then you start to get the visibility, and you're like, oh my gosh, okay, we've got some work to do.
Yeah, and that's a very good analogy. I'm going to use that, honestly.
There you go. It's all yours.
Right. When you think about it, think about it this way: like if you have an opposite side here in just a particular location, you take a location and you have thousands of OT in a manufacturing or some sort of ICS kind of environment. Your offshore rig, right? And a network unto itself, but connected to the internet and back home, right? And you have a lot of operating technology there and a lot of personnel who are doing blue collar work. And then take the equivalent of a digital enterprise with all these remote workers and so forth, and knowledge workers and everything. And now the digital rig or manufacturing factory and so forth is now the SaaS. The SaaS is OT of the digital enterprise. And so I'm going to use that, Craig. Thank you for that. Right. So a little quick word from our sponsors kind of moment here. So the guys were mentioning GRIP earlier, and I really want to thank you for that. We do appreciate the relationship that we have with Inversion 6 and our part that we play in the work that you're doing to help your clients. And it's really pretty simple, folks. It starts with SaaS footprinting to understand exactly where all these accounts are and all these identities that have access to them, just who's using what, where, when, and how. And we go back in time. We hop in the DeLorean and we go back 10 plus years to look at any sort of history of that identity and a SaaS app, whether it was old and needs to be jettisoned, and revoked, or if it's still persisting to this present day, but just looking at it past, present, and then detecting new ones in the future, so that you can look at your identity landscape. What's really going on? How do my identities look relative to all the different technology they're using? Is this appropriate use? Is it justified? What's going on in my directory? Do I have any attack vectors in Azure AD? Probably. And then also, my controls. Where are my gaps? So when it comes to how I'm managing these identities in those kinds of SaaS connections and SaaS accounts, how well am I doing at controlling it? What's unfederated versus federated? Do I have any particular unsanctioned SSO access? That happens only every day. And then being able to also classify these risks, mitigating them appropriately, all that prioritization we were mentioning earlier, and then determining, do I even need all this stuff? You wouldn't believe how much redundancy. You go out to like a Dropbox, it's sanctioned, it's what we use, and it's what we're going for, and we've done all the security and so forth. Okay, did you know you have 21 tenants? Do you really need, right? It's all kinds of ways of looking at SaaS and understanding where they overlap, where things are crossbreeding and so forth. By the way, the biggest one, dev tools and BI. Go look there.
Yeah.
I promise you, you're going to have a laundry list of BI tools and a laundry list of dev tools that all do the same thing. And then, of course, take all that insight and put it everywhere else. Being able to integrate it to the rest of the stack and extending controls, updating firewalls. Let's update a rule in an EDL on a Palo. Why not? Let's be able to initiate an Okta workflow that enrolls that app into SSO. Why not? There are a lot of different ways to integrate and orchestrate all of that intelligence that triggers any number of things, from an EDR and CrowdStrike to a workflow in the CMDB or the SAM of ServiceNow. And everything in between. And we do this again. I like how a lot of the focus has been around the clients. And so I had a quote from one that he's actually local to me. I'm in Austin, Texas, and James lives right down the road from me here. But that identity perimeter, that distributed identity perimeter, that's the issue, folks, that we continue to see. Discovering all the SaaS apps is just the first step. As Craig and Chris both mentioned, what happens after that is a lot of identity security. Being able to ensure the proper access controls, the proper access governance, and ensuring even things like your SOC 2 compliance is a big factor. And you can automate a lot of that with user access reviews and so forth. And in James's case, he actually removed like $800K in his identity costs because he had just this sprawling network of identity systems that range from all the names, the Oktas, the Azure ADs, he was doing some Google OIDC. It was everywhere. It was all over the place. But when you had that central hub that can manage that access to any SaaS, the ones that we have, the ones we used to have, and the ones we might have in the future, that's where we kind of cinched it with him. And so I appreciated that quote that he gave. And so I just wanted to share that because it does tie into that modern work strategy that we've continued to talk about, this user choice and that flexibility. That was his situation. And we were able to achieve that without compromising security. So I want to give you guys some opportunities to give the folks here on the call and any of those watching this on demand. We thank you, all of our different followers. But I want to give you the final word, final thoughts you want to give to the group here based on these perspectives today.
I would say, just like in the business, cash is king, visibility is king. Go get some visibility and then start to make good decisions.
I think this is the new open wound, when it comes to cybersecurity and risk inside large organizations and in smaller organizations as well. This is one that people aren't necessarily paying attention to, that can cause a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a tall task to get your arms around, but certainly worthwhile as more and more of our data, more and more of our applications move to SaaS and cloud altogether. This is on the critical path for risk management.
Yeah. And if I can give one to you folks, a final thought here is that we say identity is the new perimeter. Identities are assets, not people. And identities are given to people as custodians. And those custodians take that identity into a lot of places. Do you know where they're taking that most critical corporate asset? We'll help you find it, and we'll help you make it safe. And so I want to thank you all for being here today, and look forward to seeing everyone again on a future GRIP workshop.